There is something happening to you right now that you have not fully named yet. You can feel it at the edges of your awareness. This strange, persistent, slightly unsettling sense that the world around you is not quite as solid as it used to be. Conversations feel like they are happening behind glass. Places you have walked through 100 times feel strangely temporary, like stage sets that could be dismantled at any moment. Your own thoughts seem to echo in a way they never did before, as if they are no longer fully attached to the person who used to think them. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the confusion and the quiet vertigo, and the moments where you catch yourself wondering if something is wrong with you, there is a part of you that knows, not intellectually, not as a concept you read somewhere, but in the body, in the bones, there is a part of you that knows this is not breakdown, this is something else entirely. That is why you are here, because what you are experiencing right now has a name. It has mechanics. It has a structure that has been understood by quantum physicists and ancient wisdom keepers, and every person who has ever stood in the threshold between one version of themselves and another. And today, we are going to walk through all of it together, not as theory, not as something to think about, as something you feel in your body by the time we reach the end of this transmission, because the strangeness you have been living inside, the unreality, the detachment, the quiet sense that everything is shifting, is not a malfunction. It is the most precise, most intelligent, most necessary thing your consciousness could possibly be doing right now. The world is not supposed to feel real right now. Let that land. Not as reassurance, as fact. The world is not supposed to feel real right now because you are between frequencies. You are suspended in the quantum field at the exact moment where one version of your reality dissolves and another has not yet crystallized into form. And that space, that strange, floating, slightly disorienting space, is not empty. It is the most generative space in the entire architecture of transformation. It is where everything that is about to change first becomes possible. Stay with me, because we are going somewhere together today that most people never get to go, not because they are not ready, but because no one ever gave them the map. Let me take you somewhere first. Before we get into the science, before we get into the mechanics, I want you to feel the shape of what we are talking about. I want you to feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, not as information, but as something in the air. Imagine a lighthouse on a rocky coast. Not a romantic lighthouse from a painting, a real one, old stone, worn smooth by decades of salt wind. The keeper of that lighthouse has lived there so long that the rhythm of the light has become part of her nervous system. The rotation, the pulse, the reliable sweep of illumination across dark water. She does not think about it anymore. It is simply the organizing principle of her existence. The light turns. Ships are guided. She sleeps. She wakes. The light turns again. Now imagine one night The mechanism shifts, not breaks, shifts. The rotation slows, the rhythm changes, and for the first time in years, the keeper does not know exactly when the beam will sweep across the water. She stands in the tower and watches the light move in a pattern she does not recognize. And the first thing she feels is fear. Because her nervous system has been calibrated to one rhythm for so long that any deviation registers as danger. But here is what she does not know yet. The lighthouse is not malfunctioning. The mechanism has been upgraded. The new rotation reaches further. It covers more of the dark water than the old one ever could. Ships that were previously invisible to the old beam are now entering the range of the new one. The world the lighthouse can touch has expanded, but in the space between the old rhythm and the new one, there is a moment, sometimes minutes, sometimes longer, where the keeper cannot predict where the light will fall. And in that moment, everything feels uncertain. You are the lighthouse keeper, and the light is changing. That is the felt experience we are mapping today. That is the territory we are walking through together. And the first thing I want you to understand, really understand, not just hear, but feel, is that the uncertainty is the upgrade happening. The disorientation is the new range coming online. The unreality is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something so new that your current perceptual system does not yet have the architecture to interpret it as solid. Let me explain exactly why this happens. And I mean exactly. Because this is not metaphor, this is mechanics. In quantum physics, reality does not exist as a single fixed structure. This is not poetry, this is what the mathematics actually says. What exists at the most fundamental level of physical reality is a field of probabilities, a vast shimmering ocean of potential outcomes that remain in superposition, meaning they exist simultaneously as multiple possibilities until consciousness interacts with them. The physicist Amit Goswami spent decades articulating what this means for human experience. Consciousness does not simply observe reality from the outside. Consciousness participates in collapsing it into form. The act of observation, the quality, the frequency, the coherence of your awareness plays an active role in determining which possibility becomes the reality you experience. Read that again slowly. The version of life you are living right now is not simply the result of external circumstances happening to a passive observer. It is the result of which identity your consciousness has stabilized within the quantum field. Your sense of who you are, your personality, your emotional patterns, your habitual predictions about what is possible and what is not. These are not just psychological phenomena, they are the lens through which consciousness collapses probability into experience. They are the organizing principle that determines which version of the infinite field of potential becomes your actual life. And here is where everything we are talking about today starts to make sense in a way that will change how you relate to what you have been feeling. When a shift is happening, when consciousness is in the process of moving from one frequency to another, from one stabilized identity to a new and expanded one. The old identity that held the previous reality together begins to lose coherence. The neural patterns that maintained that personality, the emotional loops that reinforced it, the habitual predictions that kept collapsing the same probabilities, they start weakening. And your nervous system enters a transitional phase where the old self is dissolving, but the new self has not yet fully crystallized. The old frequency is fading. The new one is not yet fully tuned. And in that space between frequencies, perception temporarily loses its anchor. This is why the world feels unreal. Not because something is wrong with your perception, but because your perception is updating. The brain relies on identity to interpret reality. Identity is the filter through which raw sensory data becomes a coherent story about what is happening and what it means. When that filter begins changing, perception temporarily enters a state of flux. Familiar things look strange, conversations feel distant, your own thoughts sound like recordings of someone you used to be. The world you've been living in starts to feel like a set that is being quietly dismantled. That is not breakdown, that is recalibration. Your mind is reorganizing around a different version of you. And because identity and reality are deeply entangled systems, because the consciousness that observes and the field it collapses are in constant dialogue, the external world begins reflecting that shift before the conscious mind has fully understood what is happening. The feeling that reality has become strange is not a malfunction of perception. It is a signal that perception is updating. And the most important thing you can do in this moment, the thing that changes everything about how this transition unfolds, is to stop trying to fix it. Feel what happens in your body when you hear that. Stop trying to fix it, because I know that the instinct, the deep, almost physical instinct, when the world starts feeling unreal, is to grab for something solid, to return to familiar patterns, to recreate the emotional texture of the old normal, to distract yourself, to analyze your way back to certainty, to do something, anything that makes the strangeness stop. And I want to tell you something about that instinct. It is not wrong, it is not weak, it is the most ancient survival mechanism your nervous system has. The brain evolved to prefer stability over uncertainty. Uncertainty reads as threat. And when the brain detects threat, it reaches for the familiar, for the neural patterns, the emotional loops, the identity structures that have kept you safe before. This is biology, this is not failure. But here is what no one tells you about this moment. When you reach for the old normal in response to the disorientation of transformation, you collapse the previous timeline. Again, you restore the neural patterns that originally created the old reality. You restabilize the lens through which consciousness was collapsing the same probabilities. And the opening, the quantum opening that the dissolution of the old identity was creating closes. Not permanently, but it closes. And life appears to return to its previous structure. The strangeness fades, the familiar reasserts itself, And somewhere beneath the relief there is a quiet ache, because part of you knows that something was right there. Something was about to happen. And the reaching for safety closed the door just before it opened fully. This is the moment we are talking about today. This is the threshold. And the transmission I want to give you is not just the understanding of what is happening. It is the capacity to stay in the space between frequencies long enough for the new reality to crystallize, because that capacity is everything. That capacity is the difference between a transformation that completes itself and one that circles back to the beginning again and again. If this transmission is already landing in your body, if something in you is recognizing what we are mapping here, please like this video and subscribe so we can keep going deeper together. Pause here. I want to do something with you before we go any deeper. This is not symbolic. This is energetic. Place one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. Just feel the weight of your own hands for a moment. Feel the warmth of your own body. Breathe in slowly through your nose, all the way down until your belly pushes against your hand. Hold it for just a moment and release slowly through your mouth. Now say this out loud if you can. If you cannot speak it aloud, say it clearly in your mind. Say, I am not broken, I am between. The unreality I feel is not confusion, it is coherence forming. Say it again, I am not broken, I am between. The unreality I feel is not confusion, it is coherence forming. Notice what happens in your body when you say that. Not what you think about it, what you feel. There may be a slight settling, a small release of tension somewhere in the chest or the shoulders, a quality of recognition that is different from intellectual agreement. That settling is your nervous system receiving information that matches what it already knows at a level deeper than thought. That settling is the body saying, yes, this is true, this is what is happening, and it is not what I feared it was. Let that anchor in, because we are going to go much deeper now, and I want that anchor to hold as we descend. Let me tell you about what is happening inside the brain during this phase, because the neuroscience of this is as remarkable as the quantum physics, and the two together create a picture that should permanently change how you relate to the strangeness you have been feeling. Joe Dispenza, who has spent decades researching the neuroscience of transformation, describes personality as something that is not fixed, but is instead a network of repeated neural patterns reinforced by emotional memory. Every time you react to life in the same way, worrying about the same problems, replaying the same stories, expecting the same outcomes, feeling the same emotions in response to the same triggers, you strengthen the neural architecture that supports that particular identity. You are literally wiring yourself into a specific version of yourself through repetition. And because that neural architecture is what generates your predictions about the future, because the brain is constantly projecting forward using past experience to estimate what will happen next. The identity you have reinforced becomes the reality you keep collapsing. Personality creates personal reality, not as a spiritual metaphor, as a neurological fact. The version of you that exists in your nervous system determines the version of the quantum field that your consciousness collapses into experience. Now, when the identity begins changing, when the neural patterns that maintain the old personality start weakening, something very specific happens to perception. The predictions stop matching the emotional state of the nervous system. The old stories start sounding less convincing. The inner voice that used to narrate your identity with absolute authority, the one that repeated who you are and what your life is supposed to look like and what is possible and what is not, begins to sound like a recording playing in the background. It is still there, but it no longer feels like truth. It feels like something you are observing rather than something you are. This is one of the earliest signals that identity restructuring is happening, and it is one of the most disorienting, because that inner voice has been the organizing principle of your experience for so long that its loss of authority feels like losing ground. It feels like something is wrong. But what is actually happening is that the neural noise that was maintaining the old identity is decreasing, and the emotional loops are quieting. And in that quiet, brainwave activity often shifts toward slower frequencies, toward alpha and theta states associated with creativity, deep intuition, expanded perception, and access to information that is invisible in the high beta survival state. Think of it this way: high beta brain activity is the state of constant prediction and threat detection. In that state, the brain is scanning the environment at high speed, matching incoming data to familiar patterns and projecting those patterns forward into the future. It is extraordinarily efficient at maintaining the existing reality, but it is almost completely closed to anything that does not fit the existing pattern. It filters out novelty. It dismisses synchronicity. It interprets anything unfamiliar as threat and reaches for the familiar to restore stability. When the identity begins dissolving and brain activity shifts toward alpha and theta, something remarkable happens. The filtering decreases, the brain becomes less reactive and more receptive. Instead of constantly projecting the past forward, the nervous system becomes open to new patterns of perception. It starts noticing things it was previously filtering out. Connections that were always present but invisible. Synchronicities that were always occurring but dismissed. A quality of meaning in ordinary moments that the high beta survival brain was too busy predicting to perceive. This is why the world starts feeling different during a timeline transition. Not just unreal, if different in quality. Like the resolution has increased, like there is more information in each moment than there used to be, like time is moving strangely, some days blurring past, other moments expanding into something that feels almost outside of time entirely. This is not imagination. This is what happens when the brain's perceptual filters begin changing. The same world contains more of itself when you are no longer filtering it through the narrow lens of a fixed identity. And here is the part that most people miss entirely. The increased synchronicity you may be noticing right now. The meaningful coincidences, the things that seem to arrive at exactly the right moment, the conversations that contain words you needed to hear, the information that finds you before you know you are looking for it. This is not random. This is the nervous system freed from the noise of constant emotional prediction, becoming sensitive to patterns of information that were always present in the field. It is not that the universe is suddenly paying more attention to you. It is that you are suddenly paying more attention to the universe. And that shift in attention reorganizes what you perceive as available in your reality. Studies on heart-brain coherence, the state of synchronized communication between the electromagnetic field of the heart and the neural activity of the brain, show that when emotional regulation improves, when the nervous system moves out of survival-based prediction and into a more coherent state, perception expands dramatically. The brain processes information more holistically. The range of what consciousness can detect increases. And what appears from the outside as luck or sudden opportunity is, from the inside, the experience of consciousness noticing a wider field of possibility than it could access before. What feels like coincidence is the brain noticing patterns that match the emerging identity rather than the old one. When your inner state begins shifting toward a different version of yourself, your attention reorganizes around experiences that reinforce that new identity. The field was always full of those possibilities. Your previous frequency simply could not receive them. I want to pause here and ask you something genuine. Think about the moment when the strangeness first arrived for you, when the old patterns first began losing their grip, when something in you first went quiet in a way that felt both unsettling and oddly familiar. Drop that moment in the comments. What was the first internal thing that changed? Not the external circumstances, but the inner shift that preceded all of it. Every experience shared here becomes a landmark for the next person who arrives at the same place and needs to know they are not alone. Now let me take you somewhere, because there is a story that illuminates everything we have been talking about in a way that lands differently than explanation alone. And I want you to feel this in your body, not just understand it in your mind. There was a man named Elias who lived in a city built entirely on the banks of a great river. The river had been the organizing principle of that city for generations. Its commerce, its culture, its sense of time and rhythm, all organized around the river's flow. Elias had grown up with the sound of the river as the constant background of his consciousness. He knew its moods, he knew its seasons, he knew exactly how it moved and what it meant when it moved differently. The river was, in a sense, the deepest layer of his identity. It was the frequency he had been tuned to since birth. One spring, the river began to change, not dramatically at first, subtle things. The color of the water in the early morning light, the way the current moved around the old stone bridge at the center of the city. Small things that Elias noticed but could not quite name. He mentioned them to his neighbors, and they looked at him blankly. They saw the same river they had always seen. But Elias could feel that something was different, and the more he paid attention, the stranger the river looked, until one morning he stood on the bank and the river looked almost completely unfamiliar to him. The same water, the same banks, the same bridge, but something in the quality of it had changed so completely that he could not recognize it as the river he had known. He went to see an old woman who lived in a stone house at the edge of the city, a woman known for understanding things that others missed. He told her what he had been experiencing. The strangeness, the unfamiliarity, the sense that the river he had organized his entire life around was becoming something he could not recognize. And she listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said this: The river has not changed, Elias. Your eyes have. The river is showing you what it has always been, but you are seeing it now from a different depth. And things look different from a different depth. Not wrong, different. And the strangeness you feel is not the river becoming foreign. It is you becoming capable of seeing what was always there. She took him to a place on the bank where the water was very still and very deep. And she said, "Look." And he looked. And beneath the surface, in the depth that he had never been able to see before, there was an entire world. Currents moving in patterns he had never imagined. Light refracting through layers of water in colors that had no names. Life moving in the deep that had always been there, always been part of the river he thought he knew, but invisible to the surface gaze he had always used to look. The river had not become unreal. It had become more real than he had ever been capable of perceiving. And Elias stood on that bank and felt something shift in his chest. Not relief, exactly. Something deeper than relief. Recognition. The strangeness he had been afraid of was not the river becoming foreign. It was his perception becoming deep enough to see what had always been true. You are Elias. The world that feels unreal right now has not become less real. Your perception has become deep enough to begin seeing what was always beneath the surface of it. The familiar has become strange, not because it is dissolving, but because you are developing the capacity to see it more truly than you ever have before. And that expansion of perception, that deepening of the gaze, is always disorienting before it becomes illuminating. Let that land. Feel what it does in your body, because there is something in that story that is not just a metaphor, it is a map. And the map points to something very specific about what you are being asked to do in this phase of your transformation. You are being asked to stop trying to make the deep look like the surface. You are being asked to stop trying to restore the familiar interpretation of a reality that is in the process of showing you more of itself. You are being asked to tolerate the strangeness long enough for your perception to catch up to what your consciousness is already beginning to see. And I know how hard that is. I know how strong the pull toward the familiar is. I know how the mind reaches for certainty when the ground shifts. But here is the truth that changes everything. The reaching for certainty is what closes the opening. The willingness to remain in the uncertainty is what allows the new reality to crystallize. Let me go deeper into what that actually means at the level of the quantum field. Because this is where the science and the wisdom tradition say exactly the same thing in different languages. And when you hear them together, something in you recognizes it as true in a way that goes beyond belief. In quantum physics, there is a principle called coherence. Coherence describes the state in which the parts of a quantum system are in phase with each other, synchronized, organized, moving in a unified pattern. A laser is a perfect example of coherence. Ordinary light is made of photons moving in all different directions, all different frequencies, chaotic and incoherent. But in a laser, the photons are brought into phase with each other. They move in the same direction at the same frequency, with the same timing. And the result is not just brighter light. It is light that can cut through steel. Coherence does not just organize a system, it amplifies its power exponentially. Now here is what this means for consciousness. When you're in a state, your thoughts, your emotions, your nervous system's baseline frequency is coherent when all of these systems are in phase with each other rather than in conflict. Your interaction with the quantum field changes qualitatively, not just quantitatively. The quality of the collapse changes. The probabilities that your coherent consciousness interacts with are different from the probabilities that an incoherent, fragmented, fear-driven consciousness interacts with. This is why the ancient wisdom traditions across cultures and centuries placed such extraordinary emphasis on inner stillness, not as a spiritual achievement, as a practical technology. The mystics and the sages and the monks who spent decades cultivating inner silence were not escaping from reality. They were developing the coherence that allows consciousness to interact with the quantum field at a different level of precision. They were becoming lasers. And here is the thing about the phase you are in right now. The phase where the world feels unreal and the old identity is dissolving and the familiar is becoming strange. This phase, when you understand it correctly, is actually a natural movement toward coherence. Because the old identity, the network of habitual emotional patterns and neural loops and automatic predictions, was a source of enormous incoherence. All of those loops running simultaneously, all of those emotional charges firing in response to triggers, all of those conflicting stories about who you are and what is possible, that is noise. That is interference. That is the photons moving in all directions. When the old identity begins dissolving, the noise decreases. The interference quiets. And in that quiet, coherence begins to emerge spontaneously. The brain shifts towards slower, more organized frequencies. The heart and brain begin communicating more fluidly. The nervous system moves out of the constant prediction mode of high beta survival and into the receptive, expansive state of alpha and theta. And in that state, consciousness begins interacting with the quantum field at a different level of coherence. This is why the phase feels so strange and so significant at the same time. The strangeness is the noise decreasing. The significance is the coherence forming, and the two happen together inseparably, because you cannot have the coherence without first releasing the patterns that were generating the noise. Think of it like a room that has been filled with furniture for decades. So much furniture that you have forgotten what the room itself looks like. You have organized your entire life around the furniture. Where to walk, where to sit, what is possible in this space. And then someone begins removing the furniture and suddenly the room feels strange, unfamiliar, too large. The absence of the furniture that defined the space feels like the absence of the space itself. But the room has not disappeared. The room is more present than it has ever been. And in the emptiness, you can finally see what has always been there. The quality of the light, the shape of the walls, the potential of the space itself. The furniture was your identity, the room is your consciousness, and the emptiness that feels so disorienting right now is not the loss of something essential. It is the revelation of something that was always there beneath the furniture of who you thought you were. I want to pause here and do something with you, because we are at at a depth in this transmission where that intellectual understanding needs to become something the body can hold, and the body learns differently than the mind. The body learns through experience, through sensation, through the felt sense of something landing in a way that is different from hearing it. So, I want you to do something very specific. Wherever you are right now, I want you to allow your body to be completely still. Not rigid, soft. The way water is still, not frozen but settled. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw release. Let your belly be soft. And I want you to notice something in this moment of stillness, right now, in this exact moment. But there is no problem. There is no future to manage. There is no past to process. There is only this breath, this moment, this quality of awareness that is noticing all of it. That awareness, the thing that is noticing right now, is not the old identity. The old identity has thoughts and feelings and stories and predictions. But the thing that is watching all of those, the awareness itself, is prior to all of that. It is the room, not the furniture. It is the field, not the frequency that moves through it. And in this moment of stillness, you are touching that. You are resting in what you actually are beneath everything you have been told you are. Say this out loud or clearly in your mind. Say, I am the awareness that was here before the identity. I am the field that holds all frequencies. The dissolving is not my end, it is my remembering. Say it again. I am the awareness that was here before the identity. I am the field that holds all frequencies. The dissolving is not my end, it is my remembering. Notice the quality of that. Notice if something in the body responds, not with drama, with something quieter, a settling, a sense of something clicking into place. That is recognition. That is the body knowing something that the mind is still catching up to. Good. Hold that, because we are going deeper still. Here is what no one tells you about the phase where reality feels unreal. There is a specific quality of relationship with time that emerges during this transition, and it is one of the most reliable signals that a genuine quantum shift is in progress. Time stops feeling linear. This is not a metaphor. This is a perceptual fact that almost everyone going through a genuine transformation reports, and it has a precise explanation in both neuroscience and quantum mechanics. In ordinary consciousness, in the high beta state of constant prediction and identity maintenance, the brain experiences time as a linear sequence of cause and effect. Past determines present. Present determines future. The arrow of time points in one direction, and your nervous system is organized around that directionality. Your sense of self is fundamentally a temporal narrative, a story that connects the past version of you to the present version and projects that trajectory into the future. Identity is, at its core, a relationship with time. When the identity begins dissolving, that temporal narrative loses its organizing power. The past no longer feels like a fixed foundation. The future no longer feels like a predetermined trajectory. And the present moment, which has always been the only place where reality actually exists, expands. Moments feel longer. The quality of now becomes more vivid. more textured, more present. And this expansion of the present moment is not a distortion of perception, it is a correction of it. Quantum mechanics describes a reality in which time itself is far stranger than our ordinary experience suggests. The physicist Carlo Rovelli has written extensively about how time, at the quantum level, does not flow in a single direction, how the past and future are not as distinct as our macroscopic experience suggests. The arrow of time that we experience in ordinary consciousness is a function of entropy, of the movement from order to disorder at the macroscopic scale. But at the quantum level, the equations are time symmetric. The future influences the present as much as the past does. The field of probability that consciousness collapses into experience is not organized by a single temporal direction. What this means for your experience right now is this: the expansion of the present moment you may be feeling, the strange quality of time during this transition, is your consciousness beginning to interact with the quantum field in a way that is less constrained by the linear temporal narrative of the old identity. The past is losing its grip on the present, and the future, the version of reality that is crystallizing around the new frequency you are moving toward, is beginning to exert its influence on the present moment in a way it could not before. This is why synchronicities often feel like they are coming from the future, like something is reaching back through time to arrange the present in a way that will make sense later. Because in a very real sense, that is exactly what is happening. The new version of your reality, the one that is in the process of crystallizing around the new frequency of your consciousness, is already present in the quantum field as a probability. And as your consciousness begins moving toward coherence with that new frequency, the field begins reorganizing the present moment around it. What feels like coincidence is the future reaching into the present to prepare the ground. The ancient wisdom traditions knew this. Every mystical tradition that has ever existed has described a quality of time that is different from the ordinary linear sequence, what the Greeks called kairos as opposed to chronos, what the Zen masters described as the eternal now, what the Vedic tradition called the timeless ground of being from which all temporal experience arises. These were not poetic descriptions of a subjective feeling. They were reports from people who had developed enough coherence in their consciousness to directly perceive what the quantum field actually is, a field of probability that exists outside of linear time, that is collapsed into temporal sequence by the interaction of consciousness with it. When your identity begins dissolving and your consciousness begins moving toward a new frequency, you are temporarily touching that timeless ground. You are briefly perceiving the field before the collapse, rather than only the collapsed result. And that perception is simultaneously the most disorienting and the most profound experience available to human consciousness. It is disorienting because it does not fit the linear temporal narrative of the old identity. It is profound because it is the most direct contact with the actual nature of reality that most people ever have. The world feels unreal right now because you are briefly perceiving more of what is real than the old identity could hold. The unreality is not a diminishment of reality. It is an excess of it. Let me take you somewhere else now, deeper into the story, because there is another character I want to introduce you to, and her experience illuminates something about this phase that I have not yet named directly. Her name was Saraphel. She was a musician, not a famous one, not a performer, but someone for whom music was the primary language of her interior life. She had played the same instrument since childhood, and over the decades, she had developed a relationship with it that was almost indistinguishable from her relationship with herself. The way she played was the way she was. The frequency she produced was the frequency she inhabited. One day, without any external cause she could identify, she sat down to play, and the music sounded wrong to her. Not technically wrong. She was playing the same notes she had always played, with the same precision and the same care. But something in the sound was wrong. It did not resonate the way it used to. The instrument that had been the most familiar thing in her world suddenly sounded foreign to her, like hearing your own voice on a recording and not recognizing it. She spent weeks trying to fix it. She adjusted the instrument. She changed the room she played in. She tried playing differently, more carefully, less carefully, with more emotion, with less. Nothing worked. The music still sounded wrong, and the wrongness was not in the instrument. She knew that. The wrongness was in her relationship to the sound. Something in her had changed in a way that made the old frequency no longer feel like home. She stopped playing. For months, she did not touch the instrument. And in that silence, something strange began happening. She started hearing music everywhere, not imagined music, actual music, in the rhythm of conversations, in the pattern of wind through trees, in the cadence of her own breath. Music that had no notes but had structure. Music that was not organized by the scales and modes she had spent her life learning, but by something older and more fundamental, a resonance beneath all resonance. And one morning she sat down at the instrument again, not to fix what was wrong, not to return to what had been, but simply to listen, to let her hands find whatever they found. And what came out was not the music she had spent her life playing. It was something else entirely, something that made her weep without knowing why, something that sounded like what she had been hearing in the wind and the breath and the rhythm of the world for all those months of silence. She had not lost her music. She had outgrown the frequency she had been playing in. And the months of silence, the months of strangeness and wrongness and disconnection from the most familiar thing in her world, were not a loss of her gift. They were the gift expanding beyond the container it had been living in. You are Saraphel. The frequency you have been playing in has become too small for what you are becoming. And the strangeness you feel, the wrongness, the disconnection from what used to feel like home, is not the loss of your music. It is your music expanding beyond the container it has been living in. The silence is not empty. It is full of the new frequency learning to form itself in you. And here is the principle that this story is pointing toward. The principle that integrates everything we have been exploring, and gives it a shape you can hold and use. Identity is a frequency, not a metaphor, a literal frequency, a pattern of neural and electromagnetic activity that determines how consciousness interacts with the quantum field, which probabilities it collapses, which version of reality it stabilizes into experience. And like all frequencies, identity can expand, it can shift, it can move from one register to another. But the shift from one frequency to another is not instantaneous. There is a transition. And in that transition, the old frequency is no longer fully active, and the new frequency is not yet fully stabilized. And in that space between frequencies, and in that quantum superposition of old and new, the world feels exactly the way you have been describing it, unreal.
Strange, familiar and foreign at the same time, like you are watching your own life from a slight distance, like the ground beneath you is less solid than it used to be. That is not the ground disappearing, that is the ground changing its composition. And the only thing required of you in this moment is not to rebuild the old ground, not to reach for the familiar, but to allow the new ground to form beneath you, to trust the process enough to remain in the in-between long enough for the new frequency to crystallize. This is the hardest thing. And I want to be honest with you about that, because I have seen too many transmissions that make transformation sound like a graceful, luminous unfolding. And sometimes it is that, but more often, the space between frequencies is uncomfortable in a way that is not glamorous. It is quiet in a way that feels like emptiness. It is uncertain in a way that feels like lostness. And the temptation to reach for the old ground, to recreate the familiar identity, to return to the old frequency, is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of how real and how deep the transition is. The depth of the discomfort is proportional to the magnitude of the shift. And let that land. The depth of the discomfort is proportional to the magnitude of the shift. The more significant the transformation, the more completely the old identity must dissolve before the new one can crystallize. And the more completely the old identity dissolves, the more disorienting the space between feels. This is not a problem with your transformation. It is a measure of its depth. Think about what it takes to change the frequency of a vibrating string. You do not simply add a new vibration to the existing one. You must first stop the existing vibration. There must be a moment of stillness, however brief, between the old frequency and the new one. And in that moment of stillness, the string is not vibrating at all. It is simply potential, pure possibility, waiting for the new frequency to be introduced. You are the string. The stillness you are in is not absence of vibration. It is the space between the old frequency and the new one. It is the moment of pure potential that must exist before the new resonance can begin. And the unreality you feel is the felt experience of being pure potential, of existing in the quantum superposition of what you were and what you are becoming before either has fully collapsed into form. This is not metaphor, this is mechanics. Now let me talk about something very specific, because there is a response to this phase that is not the reaching for the old normal, a response that is subtler and therefore harder to catch, that can also slow the transition. And I want to name it clearly because I suspect you may recognize it.
The response is analysis. The compulsive need to understand what is happening in order to feel safe. The mind that cannot tolerate the uncertainty of the transition begins analyzing it, researching it, trying to map it, categorize it, understand it completely before allowing it to continue. And there is a paradox here that is important to understand. The understanding itself, when it becomes a strategy for controlling the process rather than a way of relating to it, can introduce the same kind of noise that reaching for the old normal introduces, can pull the nervous system back into the high beta state of prediction and control. And in that state, the coherence that is forming in the space between frequencies gets disrupted. This is the observer effect in quantum mechanics applied to the inner life. The way observation occurs influences what becomes measurable. When attention is tense, fearful, or controlling, even when that control is dressed up as intellectual understanding, it introduces noise into the system. That noise reinforces familiar probabilities rather than allowing new ones to emerge. The very act of trying to completely understand and control the transformation can interrupt it. This does not mean that understanding is the enemy. Clearly it is not, but we are here in this transmission using understanding as a doorway. But there is a difference between understanding that opens and understanding that grasps. Understanding that opens says, I see the shape of what is happening, and that seeing allows me to relax into it. Understanding that grasps says, I need to fully comprehend and control this before I can allow it to continue. The first is coherent observation. The second is the ego trying to maintain its organizing role in a process that requires it to temporarily step back. The quantum field stabilizes around coherent, relaxed observation. Not tense, grasping observation. Not fearful, controlling observation. The kind of observation that allows the field to reorganize without interference. The kind of attention that is present and aware but not clenched. The kind of watching that a gardener brings to a seedling attentive, caring, but not reaching into the soil to pull the roots up to check if they are growing. You are the gardener, and the new frequency forming in you is the seedling, and the most powerful thing you can do right now is exactly what you are doing in this moment. Being present, being aware, allowing the understanding to open rather than grasp, trusting the process enough to remain in the in-between without trying to force it to resolve faster than it is ready to. There is a phrase I want to give you for this. A way of orienting to the space between frequencies that is different from either reaching for the old normal or grasping for complete control. The phrase is, I am allowing the new to crystallize, not I am making the new happen, not I am forcing the transformation to complete. But I'm allowing the new to crystallize. I am creating the conditions that the stillness, the coherence, the relaxed and present awareness that allow the quantum field to reorganize around the new frequency that is forming in me. Say that now, out loud if you can. I am allowing the new to crystallize. I am the coherent space in which transformation completes itself. I do not need to force it. I do not need to understand it completely before I trust it. I am allowing the new to crystallize. Notice the quality of that. Notice how different it feels from the grasping. Notice the slight expansion in the chest. The quality of permission, that is the nervous system moving toward coherence. That is the gardener settling into the patient. Attentive presence that allows growth without interference. Good. Hold that, because we are coming to the deepest layer of this transmission now. The layer that integrates everything we have explored and points toward what is actually being asked of you in this phase of your becoming. There is a concept in quantum physics called decoherence. It describes what happens when a quantum system, which exists in superposition in the simultaneous possibility of multiple states, interacts with its environment in a way that forces it to collapse into a single, definite state. Decoherence is what happens when quantum possibility becomes classical reality. When the shimmering cloud of probability resolves into a single, specific, measurable outcome. What causes decoherence? Interaction, entanglement with the environment. The quantum system becomes entangled with the surrounding particles, and that entanglement forces the superposition to collapse. The more entangled a quantum system is with its environment, the more quickly it decoheres. The more quickly it collapses from possibility into a specific state. Now here is what this means for consciousness and transformation. The old identity, the network of habitual emotional patterns and neural loops and automatic predictions, is a state of deep entanglement with a specific version of the environment. Every habitual reaction you have is a thread of entanglement connecting your consciousness to a specific collapsed state of reality. Every emotional loop is a decoherence mechanism that forces the quantum field to collapse into the same familiar probability again and again. The old identity is not just a psychological pattern. It is a quantum entanglement structure that maintains the coherence of a specific version of reality by constantly automatically decohering the field in the same direction. When the old identity begins dissolving, those entanglement threads begin loosening. The automatic decoherence mechanisms weaken, and the quantum field, freed from the constant pull of the old entanglement structure, returns to superposition, returns to the state of simultaneous possibility, returns to the shimmering cloud of potential from which a new specific reality can crystallize. This is why the world feels unreal. You are perceiving the field in a state closer to superposition than you ever have before. The automatic decoherence mechanisms that used to instantly collapse the field into the familiar, specific reality of the old identity are weakening, and in their absence you are briefly perceiving the field as it actually is, not as a single fixed reality, but as a vast field of simultaneous possibility. And that perception is disorienting because your perceptual system has been calibrated for collapsed reality, for specific and definite outcomes, for the world as it appears after the decoherence has happened. Perceiving the field before decoherence, perceiving the superposition is like suddenly being able to see radio waves. The information was always there, but the perceptual system was never calibrated to receive it. You are being recalibrated right now. In this phase, Your perceptual system is expanding to include what was always there but previously invisible. And the expansion is uncomfortable before it is illuminating, because expansion always involves the temporary dissolution of the container that was too small. Here is the truth that changes everything. The unreality you feel is not the world becoming less real. It is your perception becoming real enough to see the field beneath the collapsed reality. It is your consciousness expanding to include the superposition, the shimmering possibility, that's all, that underlies every specific outcome. And that expansion is not something happening to you. It is you. It is your awareness remembering what it has always been capable of. It is the lighthouse discovering its new range. It is Seraphel hearing the music beneath the music. It is Elias seeing the depth of the river that was always there. You are not losing your grip on reality. You are gaining a grip on a larger reality than the one thy old identity could hold. And now that you understand the mechanics, now that the science and the wisdom and the parables have all pointed to the same truth from different directions, I want to bring this back to the body, because understanding is not the destination. Embodiment is. The shift needs to land not just in the mind, but in the nervous system, in the felt sense, in the place where you live. So let us do this together. One more practice, the final one for this transmission, and I want you to bring everything we have explored to this moment. Sit or lie in a position where your body can be completely at ease. Let your eyes close if that feels right. Let your breath find its own rhythm, not controlled, not manipulated, just breathing. And I want you to bring your awareness to the quality of the space between your thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. The space between them. The brief, quiet interval between one thought and the next. That space is always there. It is the superposition, the field before the collapse. And in this moment, I want you to rest your awareness in that space. You do not need to hold it. You do not need to extend it. Simply notice it. Simply be aware that it is there. That beneath every thought, every emotion, every story about who you are and what is happening to you, there is this quiet, spacious, aware presence that is not affected by any of it. That does not dissolve when the identity dissolves. That does not become unreal when the world feels unreal. That is, in fact, the most real thing there is. This is what you are. Not the thoughts, not the identity, not the old frequency or the new one. You are the awareness in which all of it arises and passes. You are the field, not the frequency. You are the room, not the furniture. You are the river, not the current that moves through it. And from that place, from that awareness that is prior to identity and prior to frequency, the dissolving of the old is not frightening. It is simply the field preparing to collapse into a new and larger form. The unreality is simply the superposition becoming briefly visible before the new crystallization completes. The strangeness is simply the awareness recognizing itself in a moment of clarity that the old identity could not provide. Say this from that place. From the awareness, not the identity, say, I am the field. I am not the frequency of what finds me. I am the awareness in which all frequencies arise. The dissolving is not my end. It is my expansion. And I am ready. Say it again. I am the field. I am not the frequency of what finds me. I am the awareness in which all frequencies arise. The dissolving is not my end, it is my expansion, and I am ready. Let that settle into the body. Let it land in the chest, in the belly, in the quality of the breath. This is not affirmation, this is recognition. This is the awareness, remembering what it has always been. And the recognition itself, the moment of remembering, is the shift completing itself. This is the transmission. This is what you came here for, not the information. Though the information is real, and the science is sound, and the mechanics are precise, but the recognition, the moment of the body saying, yes, this is true, this is what is happening, and it is not what I feared it was. I want to speak now to something that I know is present in this moment, because we have gone deep together today, and depth always surfaces what has been submerged. And what I sense is surfacing right now, for many of you, is a question that is not quite a question. It is more like a held breath, and it sounds something like, but how long? Like, how long do I stay in the between? How long before the new crystallizes? How long before the world feels solid again? And I want to answer that honestly. Not with a number, because there is no number. Not with a timeline, because timelines are a function of the old identity, and the new one does not operate on the same schedule. But with a principle that is more useful than a timeline, the new crystallizes when the old fully releases, not before. The new frequency stabilizes when the consciousness stops reaching back for the old one, not before. The world feels solid again when the awareness rests fully in the new frequency, rather than straddling the space between the old and the new. And that is not a passive process. It is not something that simply happens to you while you wait. It is something you participate in actively, not by forcing the new to arrive faster, but by releasing the old more completely, by noticing every moment when you reach back for the old normal and choosing consciously to return to the awareness instead. By practicing the stillness that allows coherence to form. By allowing the understanding we have explored today to shift, not just how you think about the transition, but how you feel about it, how you inhabit it, how you relate to the strangeness. Because the relationship to the strangeness is everything. The person who experiences the unreality as threat and reaches for the old normal, their transition circles back. The person who experiences the unreality as signal and allows it, their transition completes. The difference between these two people is not talent or spiritual advancement or cosmic selection. It is simply the understanding of what the strangeness means.
And now you have that understanding. Now you know what the strangeness means. Now the unreality is not a signal of breakdown, but a signal of recalibration. Now the disorientation is not evidence of failure, but evidence of activation. And that knowing, that reframing that is not just intellectual, but felt in the body, anchored in the nervous system, changes the quality of your relationship to the process. And that relationship changes the process itself. Because you are not separate from what is happening. You are the active variable in it. The way you relate to the transition is part of what determines how the transition unfolds. The quality of your observation influences what becomes measurable. The coherence of your awareness shapes what crystallizes from the field. You are not a passive recipient of transformation. You are the consciousness through which transformation occurs. You are the awareness that holds the space in which the new frequency forms. You are the field in which the new reality crystallizes. And the shift you feel is not something happening to you. It is you recognizing yourself. It is the awareness waking up to its own nature. It is the lighthouse discovering its new range. It is the musician hearing the music beneath the music. It is the keeper of the river finally seeing the depth that was always there. This is not metaphor, this is mechanics. And you are the mechanic.